This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you want to pre-order some Bloomburrow, use my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa, and in this video I'm continuing with my Bloomburrow Limited set review. So far I've looked at all the multicolored, colorless white, blue, and black cards, and in this video we're looking at the red ones. For each of these cards I'll discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means draft and sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description for this video. There are a few important things to keep in mind as I review these cards. First, remember, we're only talking about draft and sealed. I'm only going to be talking about cards that are going to be in play boosters as a result. Furthermore, I'm only looking at cards from the main set in this video. Play boosters in this set do have special guests, but I'll talk about those in a later video. Second, these are my evaluations of these cards before actually playing with them, since the goal is to have my set review done in time for the pre-release. That means I'm not going to be right about everything, but I'll be updating my thoughts on the format as it develops. Lastly, I want to let you know that there are some set review related perks for being a channel member or a patron. You get access to my ongoing set notes during preview season, and you also get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete. If those perks interest you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, without further ado, let's dive in with a look at all the red cards in Bloomburrow. First up, it's Agate Assault, which for 2 generic and a red is a common sorcery. Choose one. Agate Assault deals 4 damage to target creature. If that creature would die this turn, exile it instead, or exile target artifact. 3 mana to do 4 at instant speed is usually premium, but dropping down to sorcery is a pretty big downgrade, even with the additional graveyard hate and the ability to go after artifacts. I think it falls shy of being premium removal as a result, though you're always going to play the first copy of this, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Alania's Pathmaker, which for 3 generic and a red is a 4/2 Otter Wizard at common. When it enters, you exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play that card. This is a great common. It's virtually always going to be a 2-for-1. A 4-power creature can trade for a whole lot of stuff. Of course, 2 toughness means it goes down easy, but your opponent still usually has to use a card to make it happen, so you're not going to be heartbroken about that since it effectively drew you a card, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Artist's Talent, which for 1 generic and a red is a rare enchantment class. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. You can also pay mana costs to level it up at sorcery speed, so you can pay 2 generic and a red to make it level 2, at which point it gains non-creature spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast, and you can pay 2 generic and a red to level it up to level 3, and it says if a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent opponent controls, it deals that much damage plus 2 instead. This looks pretty bad to me, even with the spell deck in the format. It doesn't do anything on its own, and the rummage effect isn't that great, and having to sink 3 mana into cost reduction isn't that good either, and then level 3, while it can be good, is still way too specific for Limited. This just doesn't look worth the card or the mana investment in Limited, even in a spell deck. I think it's an F. Next up, it's Blacksmith's Talent, which for 1 red mana is an uncommon enchantment class. When it enters, you create a colorless equipment artifact token named Sword. With equipped creature gets +1/+1 and equipped for 2 generic. You can take it to level 2 for 2 generic and a red, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, attach target equipment you control to up to 1 target creature you control, and then level 3 you can get to for 3 generic and a red after that, and during your turn, equipped creatures you control have double strike and haste. Paying 1 red mana for a +1/+1 equipment with equip 2 would not be enough on its own, although that's a little better in this set because of Valiant. The good news is, as you upgrade this, it does become a pretty real problem, capable of triggering Valiant for free every turn, and level 3 is no joke at all. I think this is a C+. Next up, it's Blooming Blast, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant with Gift a Treasure. That means you can promise an opponent a gift as you cast it. If you do, they create a treasure token before its other effects. It does 2 damage to target creature. If the gift was promised, it also deals 3 damage to that creature's controller. 2 mana to do 2 to a creature at instant speed is like a C. You can trade up with it sometimes, but there's a whole lot you can't kill with it. You should virtually never give your opponent the treasure in the early game. Like if you use this to kill their 2-drop and you give them a treasure, that's a really bad idea. You're probably going to fall behind because you're giving them a significant mana boost in the early stage of the game where that matters the most, and you're like killing a 2-drop. But later in the game, when treasure doesn't matter that much, you do get a free 3 damage to your opponent, and that definitely matters. Sometimes it'll even close out games, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Brambleguard Captain, which for 3 generic and a red is a 2/3 mouse soldier at uncommon. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target creature you control gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is Brambleguard Captain's power. The stat line is not great, but it can at least buff itself to a 4/3 even when it's on its own. Ideally, you play this on a turn and can use the buff right away to either enable a creature to have a much bigger attack or trigger Valiant, or ideally, both. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Brazen Collector, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Raccoon Rogue. At uncommon, it's got First Strike, and when it attacks, you add 1 red mana. Until end of turn, you don't lose this mana as steps and phases end. A 2-mana 2/1 First Strike is a nice creature in limited, whether you're attacking or blocking, so the added bonus of getting some spare mana is nice. The idea is that it'll help you with the expend mechanic and or ramp your mana more generally, and if you play this on 2 and attack with it on 3, it's likely to give you that mana and survive the attack too. That's going to feel pretty good, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Byway Barterer, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 Raccoon Rogue. At rare, it's got Menace. Whenever you expend 4, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 2 cards. A 3-mana 3/3 Menace is solid, and this expend payoff is pretty sweet. Once you're in top deck mode, it can really let you rip through your deck, which is pretty likely to win you the game. It is a little bit awkward earlier in the game, like, the first time you expend, you probably don't want to do this, but the time after that, or maybe the time after that, you probably will go for it. So I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Conduct Electricity, which for 4 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 6 damage to target creature and 2 damage to up to 1 target creature token. This is virtually identical to Trick Shot, a card we saw in Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and I imagine it will perform about the same here. Both sets had a big token theme, so you can count on this killing some big creature and picking off a random token a decent chunk of the time, but it'll almost never feel like you're getting a great deal. It's just too expensive. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Coruscation Mage, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Otter Wizard. At uncommon, it's got Offspring for 2 generic. That means as you cast it, you can pay an additional 2 generic, and if you do, when this creature enters, you create a 1/1 token copy of it. Whenever you cast an on-creature spell, this creature deals 1 damage to each opponent. I'd play this if it didn't have Offspring, especially in blue-red. This style of creature always applies very real pressure on your opponent, and paying 4 for a 2/2 and a 1/1 that has this ability too is a pretty good rate, and you can always choose one or the other, and when you get 2 bodies, the pressure is obviously even more intense. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Dragonhawk, Fate's Tempest, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/5 legendary bird dragon at mythic rare. It's got flying, and when it enters or attacks, exile the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of creatures you control with power 4 or greater. You may play those cards until your next instep. At the beginning of your next instep, Dragonhawk deals 2 damage to each opponent for each of those cards that are still exiled. So at worst, this is a 5-mana 5/5 flyer that does 2 to the opponent. That's like a B, and it's way better than that. This is because it's possible it does more damage and or draws you even more cards. And yeah, if you play this on 5, you're unlikely to play the cards you hit, but you should still run it out on 5 if you can, especially because on your next turn you get the trigger again with all of your mana untapped. And if you draw it late, you may get a full-blown 2-for-1 right away. This is a bomb. It's going to give you something immediately and really snowball from there, giving it an A. Next up, it's Emberheart Challenger, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Mouse Warrior at rare. It's got Haste and Prowess, and it's got Valiant, which means whenever you target it with a spell or ability for the first time in a turn, something happens. In this case, you exile the top card of your library. Until the end of your turn, you can play that card. A 2-mana 2/2 with Haste and Prowess is a card you play 100% of the time and feel pretty good about, and this Valiant trigger is some serious business. It is true that you're not always going to have the mana to cast the exiled card, since it will often cost mana to trigger Valiant, but there are lots of cheap and free ways to trigger it. Do keep in mind that this only gives you until the end of your turn to play that card. It's not one of these that says you have until the end of your next turn to play the card. It's still great. It's a potential card advantage engine that has an amazing baseline. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Festival of Embers, which for 4 generic and a red is a rare enchantment. During your turn, you may cast instant and sorcery spells from your graveyard by paying 1 life in addition to their other costs. If a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to sacrifice Festival of Embers. Having to pay 5 for this up front is a real problem. You still have to pay the cost of the spells you cast from your graveyard, so that means you're usually going to get stone nothing the turn you play it, and after that you'd better hope you have impactful spells in your graveyard to go off with, and that's far from a guarantee, even in a format with a spell deck. There might be an occasional deck that can go off with this, and that's going to be pretty sweet, but this just seems too slow for today's limited. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Flame Cash Gecko, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Lizard Warlock at uncommon. When it enters, if an opponent lost life this turn, you add black-red, and it has an activated ability where you pay 1 generic and a red and discard a card to draw a card. If you've ever played with Burning Tree Emissary, you know getting the mana back that you spend on your 2-drop can be really good. Now, it's going to be harder and limited to make it so you can use that mana right away, both because you're less likely to have a deck filled with 2-drops, and because you have to make your opponent lose life, which isn't always going to be the case on turn 2. There are some 1-mana creatures that can make it happen, though. So if you play a 1-drop on turn 1 that gets in for a hit on 2, then drop this and another 2-drop, you're going to be a favorite to win the game in a big way. It's nice that even in the late game when you're less likely to be able to use the mana on something, you can just use it to activate the ability, and rummaging is pretty nice upside on a solid card anyway. So this card does have a really high ceiling when things go right, but I don't think you'll go 1-drop, play this, play another 2-drop on turn 2 often enough for this to get a really high grade. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Frilled Spark Shooter, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/3 Lizard Archer at common with Menace and Reach. When it enters, it does so with a +1/+1 counter on it if an opponent lost life this turn. I don't love this. 4 mana for a 3/3 Menace Reach is like a D. That's just too far below the curve. The upside here isn't completely insane. I mean, yeah, 4 mana, 4/4 with Menace and Reach is like a C+, but I think that means this is going to interplay as a really subpar creature a little bit too often. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Harnesser of Storms, which for 2 generic and a red is a 1/4 Otter Wizard at uncommon. Whenever you cast a non-creature or otter spell, you may exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. This ability triggers only once each turn. Because you generally have to spend mana to trigger this, it won't be that easy to cast the spells it reveals until the late game, but hitting land drops early with it feels pretty good, and in the late game it can really let you go off. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Heartfire Hero, which for 1 red mana is a 1/1 Mouse Soldier at uncommon with Valiant. It gets a +1/+1 counter, and when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. This is a nice 1-drop for any Valiant deck, as just spending a single mana on a creature that can grow feels pretty great, especially when that creature can do damage equal to its power when it dies. It can only hit players, keep that in mind, but that is good news for like the black-red deck, for example. I'm giving this a C+. Next up, it's Hearthborn Battler, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/3 Lizard Warlock at rare with haste. Whenever a player casts their second spell each turn, Hearthborn Battler deals 2 damage to target opponent. This always hurts your opponent whether you double spell or they do, and it has an almost passable stat line. It won't trigger as often as you'd like in limited though. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Hired Claw, which for 1 red mana is a 1/2 Lizard Mercenary at rare. Whenever you attack with 1 or more lizards, Hired Claw deals 1 damage to target opponent, and you can pay 1 generic and a red to put a +1/+1 counter on Hired Claw. Activate only if an opponent lost life this turn and only once each turn. If you drop this on turn 1, it can end up snowballing in a hurry, as it can grow itself all on its own. It can also do it at instant speed, so if you attack, you can threaten to turn it into a 2/3 while also getting in for extra damage, and if you get it late, it's not too shabby either, provided you have a lizard on the board who can attack, which isn't a huge ask for red. This type of effect that you get a benefit from when you damage the opponent is well supported in this set overall too, giving this a B. Next up, it's Hoarder's Overflow, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon enchantment. Whenever it enters, and whenever you expend 4, you put a stash counter on it. You can pay 1 generic and a red and sacrifice it and discard your hand and then draw cards equal to the number of stash counters on Hoarder's Overflow. This is pretty bad for limited. It's something you spend mana on early and it won't do anything for a very long time. And even if you get it late, you have to start expending for it to do something. This looks really bad for limited. It's just too slow and only worth using once your hand is empty or near empty, giving it an F. Next up, it's Kindle Spark Duo, which for 2 generic and a red is a 1/3 Lizard Otter at common. You can tap it to deal 1 damage to target opponent, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you untap it. So like all the duos, this is kind of a signpost common that supports 2 different decks. It works well in the Lizard deck because it does damage to the opponent, and it works well in the Otter deck, which is a spell deck, because it will untap when you play non-creature spells. The stat line isn't great, but it does enable both of those decks pretty effectively. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Manifold Mouse, which for 1 generic and a red is a 1/2 Mouse Soldier at rare. It has Offspring for 2 generic. At the beginning of combat on your turn, target mouse you control gains your choice of Double Strike or Trample until end of turn. This can target itself and its offspring, and obviously if you have both in play, you get this trigger twice, which is also another free way to trigger Valiant, in addition to just being really good at making your mouse attacks better. I think most of the time you're going to wait until you can offspring this, but it's not bad on turn 2 either. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Might of the Meek, which for 1 red mana is a common instant. Target creature gains Trample until end of turn. It also gets +1/+0 until end of turn if you control a mouse. Draw a card. It's nice that this is cheap and it replaces itself, but 1 mana for +1/+0 in Trample isn't that good because most of the time your creature's still going to die in combat. Sure, you get some extra damage in, but that's not the best deal. And sure, red has lots of mice, but there will be times where you don't even get that +1/+0, and that will feel really bad. So even though this is cheap and replaces itself, it's not that good. We've seen time and time again, even when a card is a one-mana cantrip, that doesn't keep it from performing poorly. Now, in most sets, I would think this would be a D, but because of Valiant, I think this is something that will actually make the cut a decent chunk of the time, giving it a C-. Next up, it's Playful Shove, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon sorcery. It deals 1 damage to any target, draw a card. If you pick something off with this, it's going to feel really good, and you can also use it to trigger Valiant sometimes. That's not always going to be what you want to do with it. Sometimes you'll just ping your opponent and draw the card, but this does give you a way to trigger Valiant that is also really good against X1s. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Quake Tusk Boar, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 5/5 elemental boar at uncommon, and it has reach, trample, and haste. Charging Monster Soar was a super good limited card, and this adds reach to the mix. Now granted, limited formats have gotten more powerful in the years since Ixalan, but I still think this looks pretty powerful. Because it has haste, it does usually give you value up front in the form of a nice attack that came out of nowhere. That first attack will frequently go really well, and then your opponent has to brace themselves for a second one on the next turn, or they're really in trouble. So it may just be a French vanilla creature, but it's a very good threat. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Rabid Gnaw, which for 1 generic and a red is an uncommon instant. Target creature you control gets +1/+0 until end of turn, then it deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. This is a great removal spell. You have to be a little careful about when you fire it off, since you can get 2 for 1 if you aren't careful, but most of the time, this will let you kill a creature, usually trading up, and in some occasions you can get a 2 for 1, like if the +1/+0 helps your creature win and survive combat. It also triggers Valiant, potentially at instant speed, which on top of a removal spell is going to be awesome, giving this a B. Next up, it's Raccoon Rallier, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 Raccoon Bard at common. You can tap it, and target creature you control gains haste until end of turn, activate only as a sorcery. These creatures with passable stat lines that can tap to give other creatures haste play okay, and this is yet another free way to trigger Valiant, giving it a C. Next up, it's Reptilian Recruiter, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 4/2 Lizard Warrior at uncommon. It's got Trample, and when it enters, you choose target creature. If that creature's power is 2 or less, or if you control another lizard, gain control of that creature until end of turn, untap it, and it gains haste until end of turn. This format does not have much of a sacrifice theme, so you can't really abuse this. However, it is just a good thing at the top of your curve in an aggro deck, and that's what lizard decks are going to be, since it gets a blocker out of the way and sends in a bunch more damage. In a pinch, it's also a card that you can use to trigger Valiant on your own stuff. That said, the stat line's not great, and the ETB doesn't tend to be good all the time either, especially if you're not playing lizards, giving it a C. Next up, it's Roughshod Duo, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/2 Mouse Raccoon. At common, it's got Trample, and whenever you expend 4, target creature you control gets +1/+1 and gains Trample until end of turn. So this little signpost common works well with the Mouse deck because the expend trigger targets something, and it works well with the Raccoon deck because that expend mechanic is the Raccoon deck's thing. The stat line here is pretty rough, but the expend upside here is pretty legit. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Sazakap's Brew, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant, gift a tapped fish. As an additional cost to cast this spell, discard a card. Target player draws 2 cards. If the gift was promised, target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Thrill of Possibilities is usually a playable card, especially when there's a spell deck in a format, and this format has one. The trick upside here is nice, although +2/+0 is the kind of buff that has sort of narrow uses, since it doesn't make your creature any less likely to die in combat than it was before most of the time. But, of course, it does trigger Valiant, and it's upside on something I'm probably playing one of anyway a lot of the time in the format, giving it a C. Next up, it's Season of the Bold, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a mythic rare sorcery. Choose up to 5 paw prints worth of modes. You may choose the same mode more than once. For 1 paw print, you can create a tapped treasure token. For 2, you can exile the top 2 cards of your library. Until the end of your next turn, you may play them. And for 3 paw prints, until the end of your next turn, whenever you cast a spell, Season of the Bold deals 2 damage to up to 1 target creature. The mode that's consistently going to be the strongest is the 2-paw mode, because it just straight up gives you cards to play, and if you combine it with the treasure, you're more likely to be able to play them. However, it's notable that the 3-paw mode counts spells on the current turn and the next turn, so if you have a few spells in hand and combine it with the second mode, you're likely to be able to shock a bunch of stuff, which is powerful too. It is a little unfortunate that the 1-paw mode is pretty bad in Limited. Like, you're never going to choose 5 paws with this on the first mode in Limited, just because treasure is rarely that useful. So mostly you're going to have to lean on the 2 and 3-paw modes. And the 3-paw one is pretty situational and limited, so it's mostly, again, about that 2-paw mode. I think it's still a pretty good card, but some of the others are bombs, and I don't think this one gets there, giving it a B. Next up, it's Steam Path Charger, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/1 Lizard Warlock at common, and it has Offspring for 2 generic, and when it dies, it deals 1 damage to target player. A 2-mana 2/1 that does 1 to a player when it dies isn't great, even with one of the archetypes in the format being really into doing damage to the opponent. 4 mana for a 2/1 and a 1/1 that has the same trigger also isn't especially good. I kind of have a hard time imagining this being a premier 2-drop for red decks, even in the black-red color pair. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Storm Splitter, which for 3 generic and a red is a 1/4 Otter Wizard at Mythic Rare. It's got haste. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, create a token that's a copy of Storm Splitter. Exile that token at the beginning of the next end step. This is a cool design, but not really one that you can abuse in Limited. It's below rate in terms of its stats, and while getting temporary 1/4s doesn't hurt, they aren't exactly game-breaking either, and it's not like you're going to make a whole board full of them in Limited, so I think this is just a C-. Next up, it's Sunspine Lynx, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 5/4 Elemental Cat at rare. Players can't gain life, damage can't be prevented. When it enters, it deals damage to each player equal to the number of non-basic lands that player controls. A 4-mana 5/4 isn't that great these days. I mean, it is a good stat line, but it's not enough for a card to get to the B range all on its own. And the rest of the text on the card is frequently irrelevant. There is a life gain deck in the format, so that might be useful there, and the Lynx might do 1 or 2 damage to your opponent on ETB, although keep in mind the effect is symmetrical. So mostly what we're talking about here is a 4-mana 5/4, so I think it's just a C+. Next up, it's Take Out the Trash, which for 1 generic and a red is a common instant. It deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker. If you control a raccoon, you may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. If this always looted, it would be a straight-up B, and 2-mana deal 3 instants are premium on their own anyway. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Teapot Slinger, which for 3 generic and a red is a 3/4 Raccoon Warrior at uncommon. It's got Menace, and whenever you expend 4, it deals 2 damage to each opponent. A 4-mana 3/4 with Menace is fine, and this expend payoff is pretty legit. If you're spending 4 mana on spells and doing 2 damage with each one of them, your opponent's going to have a tough time. It can also help the black-red deck get going, since it does like doing damage to the opponent, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Valley Flamecaller, which for 2 generic and a red is a 3/3 Lizard Warlock at rare. If a lizard, mouse, otter, or raccoon you control would deal damage to a permanent or player, it deals that much damage plus 1 instead. Obviously enough, you're very likely to have creatures with these 4 types. Most of the creatures we saw in this video have one of these types, right? So it is going to augment your board the turn it comes down a lot of the time, because it effectively gives all your creatures with these types plus 1 plus 0. And it also counts itself, so it's effectively a 3-mana 4/3. So sounds pretty good to me overall. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Valley Rally, which for 2 generic and a red is an uncommon instant with Gift of Food. Creatures you control get +2/+0 until end of turn. If the gift was promised, target creature you control gains first strike until end of turn. Trumpet Blast-like effects tend to be okay in formats where red has a legit go-wide theme, and that is the case here. Giving your opponent a food in exchange for first strike on one creature isn't always going to be worth it, but if it helps your creature win combat and survive, giving your opponent the gift makes sense, because the food is less likely to be as valuable as the creature you're killing. It also means this has a mode as a more legitimate combat trick than most Trumpet Blasts do, and of course, it helps you trigger Valiant. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's War Squeak, which for 1 red mana is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature. When it enters, target creature an opponent controls can't block this turn, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1 and has haste. This is a super aggressive aura and will probably be right at home in both red, white, and black, red. Shutting off your opponent's best blocker while sending in your brand new creature with a buff drastically alters combat and the race, and is often worth the investment of a card and a mana. It also triggers Valiant, of course, and when you do that, it might feel really absurd. giving it a C. Next up, it's Whisker Quill Scribe, which for 1 generic and a red is a 2/2 mouse citizen at common with Valiant. You may discard a card. If you do, draw a card. This has passable stats and a Valiant trigger that's useful, albeit unexciting. I'm giving this a C-. And our last card is Wildfire Howl, which for 1 generic and 2 red is an uncommon sorcery. It has gift a card. It deals 2 damage to each creature. If the gift was promised, it deals 1 damage to any target and 2 damage to each creature. So this format does feel like it has more small creatures than most, so Pyroclasm might be a little better here than it is in most sets. Of course, red, awkwardly, is largely an aggro color with lots of small creatures itself, so you might hurt yourself more than your opponent. The gift up card part here doesn't offer the most impressive improvement, but you can use it to make sure an opposing X3 goes down, or to trigger Valiant, or to ping your opponent. Those effects often aren't going to be worth a card, though. Overall, this feels more like a sideboard card than anything, and you can really only make it work in an unusual red deck that doesn't have its own small creatures, so I don't even think it's that good of a sideboard card. I'm going to say it's a sideboard C-. So those are all the red cards in Bloomburrow. I'll be back next time to look at all the green ones. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. If you want to catch the rest of the set review, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the set review videos that are already out there, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.